thing began in the end of 90s when, after the last lost referendum by PQ replaced Mr. Parizeau which was forced somehow to abandon the leadership of the PQ because of his inability to accept the results of the 1995 referendum and the words which were controversial. PQ went after Mr. Bouchard from the Conservatives, and through a very also astute way forced the community movement, the mouvement social, the social movement, and the labor movement to accept his idea of downsizing radically social services by almost 25%. That was the effort demanded in a 3-year term between 97 and 2000, while Quebec's GDP grew 61%, and it was done with the great ability of the charismatic figure of Lucien Bouchard, which essentially led the social movement to believe that these were the conditions to unite in order to obtain the favorable conditions for another referendum, which would be this time to win the next referendum. Essentially, Bouchard sat down all the leaders of the different sectors with the bosses and convened that that's the way to do. We have to balance the budget. Donc, la loi du déficit zéro. No deficits anymore, which means cuts in the services. In that time, a bunch of the activists in the left political movement, with a bunch of union activists, intermediary, if you wish, members of the union leadership, and also a bunch of nationalists, which were progressive nationalists within the PQ, and people like me coming from social movements like anti-war movements, to think about an alternative. It was called Rassemblement pour une alternative politique, gathering for an alternative, a political alternative, which aimed to be a movement in the beginning, but very soon we arrived to the conclusion that it has to become a party because there was no offer, and we had to have an independent voice and an alternative to the neoliberal agenda. It was an incredibly dark period of the, I would say, social and labor movement in Quebec, because they accepted, they completely compromised with the neoliberal agenda. So out of it also came the idea that we have to have an alternative. That was in November 1997. Little by little, this grew up to a party, which then unified by bits and pieces other, I would say, groups. And through a very successful by-election campaign and a good riding, which is the riding now that I represent, a new party was created in 2002, which was named Union des Forces Progressistes. But what is the reality behind that? It is because it was formed at that time because it was at the height of a cycle of a very dynamic popular movement too. La Fédération des Femmes du Québec, the feminist movement, was very radical in those era. In 1995, they organized successfully a long march between all regions, ending up in Quebec City and obtaining important gains, not only for the women, but also, for example, for the minimum wage. So they had a broad spectrum of social demands, and they exercised a good leadership. There were also a cycle of very successful mobilization against globalization. All those mobilization by alternative movements were relatively successful, and namely also the anti-war movement, in which I was involved through the Iraq issue, the anti-Bush and the war of aggression against Iraq. So this was the backdrop on which was created this new party, left-wing party, internalizing and integrating all those demands. And little by little it grew. And why Québec Solidaire? Because around that time, around 2005, although the neoliberal agenda was very successful in obtaining a lot of I would say, demands on behalf of the social movement, they still encountered a lot of resistance, for example, in sectors like privatizing health or decapping the tuition fees, how do you say it, déplafonner. Decapping the tuition fees. The student movement resisted a lot. They couldn't also obtain the agreement of people in, decapping also other tariffs, for example, hydroelectricity. Since a long time, hydroelectricity in Quebec has a symbolic significance, which makes it very difficult for Hydro-Québec to increase dramatically the tariffs as they wish to do so. So these neoliberals, represented again by Lucien Bouchard, headed by Lucien Bouchard, wrote a manifesto which was called the Manifeste des Lucides, the manifesto of those who are lucid.
Yeah, clear-sighted.
Clear-sighted. For them, clear-sightedness, meaning, of course, that Quebec has important retardation from the performance of capitalistically integrated societies, that worker unions were just, backward institutions which are hindering necessary reforms for Quebec to become a good place for investment and for economical activity. So we have to accept to overcome these resistances, these reactionary resistances. We have to be clear-sighted, lucid, and go on. And a bunch of us, we wrote a counter-manifesto, which had a very important, much broader than the left, the political left which had. We wrote a counter-manifesto which was called Le Manifeste pour un Québec Solidaire. Okay? The name of the party was not yet defined. The two formations that founded the party were not united yet. We intended to do so. We were in process. But we felt the emergency to write a counter-manifesto, which for a year, or almost a year, animated a lot of debates in universities, in radio, and TV, in the newspapers.
You mean it took a year to write, or a year?
No, a year of debate. We write it. In fact, the Manifesto of the Lucid came out in October. 3 weeks later, we had our manifesto. The Manifesto of Lucid was signed by several prominent ministers of previous governments, several important economists, chief businessman, chief editorialist, that was the big elite. But we wrote a manifesto signed by artists, by human rights activists, by independent journalists, and there was me, there was François David, a few people like that from the spectrum, and some alternative economists, things like that. And I don't know if you were in Quebec in that time, 2005.
No, I'm here.
It had a good resonance among the population, which drew a lot of support, and which also gave the idea that this new party could as well be named the party Québec Solidaire, coming out of that manifesto to show that we can imagine a society organized completely differently from the ideas of these guys and this elite. When I first ran for Union des Forces Progressistes in 2003, in my riding, we were 1% at the national level. In 2007 and 2008, in our first two general elections, we were 3% and then almost 4%. And since I have been elected, we are now in general opinion polls almost 10%. In fact, in the last two polls, 2 or 3 national polls in Quebec, we are in front of ADQ, Action Démocratique du Québec. We are surpassing them at the national level. Now, while I'm saying that, on the other hand, we know also, and that's where that fight against those two manifestos after 1 year is important, is that in January 2007, although in 2007 we made only 3% at the election time, but 2 months before, when sondage, maison de sondage, opinion poll, very important opinion poll organization in Quebec made a poll not based on for whom you're going to vote, you know, not along the political divisions, but about the issues raised by the two manifestos. Okay, should we rise the tuition fees? Should we rise the service fees for things like hydroelectricity? Is economical development of regions more important, or paying the debt? Things like that, okay? 6 issues which were in debate between the Lucids and the Solidaires, okay? And take into account that the big media were in the hands of the Lucids, you know, they were propaganding a lot. After a year, the Lucids demanded a poll on those issues. And guess what? On all the issues but one, almost the president of CROP, that firm of opinion polling, confessed himself that he tried everything he could to bring the acceptable bias to obtain favorable answers to the proposals of the Lucids, but Solidaire won. The Solidaire won, sometimes by a margin of 2-1, okay, on the issues themselves. But still, despite this fact, on election time, when people go to vote, we only had 3% of support, and then 4% a year and a half later. Why? Because the political voting system and the political habits and the dynamics of this mode of election does not really allow for small parties, even if they're much in agreement with a lot of, you know, the sentiments and the opinions and the leaning of important part of the society, to cap this thing. And we see it again. Although people, for example, when they ask to people, these are the prominent figures of the different parties. Jean Charest for the Liberals, Madame Marois for the PQ, the chief of the ADQ, and myself as the representative of Québec Solidaire, I obtain a much more important favor from the public than even Madame Marois, who is the chief of opposition. The only one who has beaten me in the last 2 polling is a member of PQ who used to be for 30 years one of the most important actors and loved actors in Quebec, okay? His name is Pierre Curzi. So I guess it's not because of his opinions, but because of the fact that... So our opinions, or the general impression of our proposals for the public receives agreement, at least, you know, some sympathy from the people. But when we ask in the polling, we still are at, you know, around the 10%. The social left is very strong in Quebec, despite all, you know. So we have a good capacity if we are able to present a credible alternative and to give a reason to hope. I don't want to use the words of my idol, Mr. Obama, although I sometimes try, you know, but I think no. But I hear it all day. You know, people need, before choosing us, to have a reason to believe in us. Okay, they find what we say interesting and tempting, intéressant. Convaincant, convincing, but they are not at all convinced that it has any chance of succeeding in this political machine. So we have to be patient and find the means to give them reason to really believe that they won't waste their vote if they vote for us. So.